let's click ahead on, let's go ahead to a couple more slides here. That's me. Okay, keep going. Slide 4.
Get warmed up here.
Yeah.
That's funny.
That's me.
That's her. Okay, so right here, we're doing this today. We've had conversations over the last 2 years pretty intensively about, is the Michigan Good Food Charter a policy document? Yes, it is. If it is, then, and if we are looking at leading on that policy document, what does that mean to do public policy advocacy? And all of you have different capacities in this regard. We're going to talk about that. But the goal is you want to engage more in public policy advocacy, but you're not entirely sure where to start. So today, is about basically addressing barriers that, people experience. We're going to demystify the process. That to me is a really huge issue for a lot of folks, is it's so hard to understand how this legislative process works. And we're also going to look at tips and tools for effective public policy advocacy. And then we're going to look at sort of just beginning to explore first steps in developing a strategic public policy advocacy plan. Now, let me bring up 3 things here. One, this webinar today is intended to be a general overview. We're not going really deep in any one thing. When we sort of were cooking this up, we thought we would do the general overview, and then the steering committee is going to have a face-to-face meeting where we use some of the tools you received as handouts, particularly the planning document. We're going to be using that to do a deep dive and develop our own strategic plan. The second thing I want to say is that, my world is the state legislature, but I can guarantee you everything we talk about today can apply to your work with a county commission, can apply to your work with a city council, can apply to your work with a school board. And I will try my best to step back a second from the state legislative terms to remind you what are some of the basic things you're looking at this point, regardless of the policymaking environment. The third thing is, you'll notice that I've got a doorknob in a lot of these slides, and that's intentional. I want to help you open that door. I can't make you walk through the threshold. I do advocacy trainings all the time, and I hope that is lots of fun, and I love doing them. I've told Jude, I'm happy to do these for folks, but the bottom line is, as fun as this is, it's about action. It's not about a training. So, all right, so let's look at, one of the first things I think is a major barrier to public policy advocacy, particularly for the groups that are involved in the Good Food Charter, is we need to sort of have a common, understanding of what these words mean. So what is public policy? And, they range from everything from laws, that are passed at the state level, laws that are passed by Congress. By the way, there's no congressman or congresswoman in Lansing. Those folks are all in DC. The judicial decisions, which really, that's where you see folks like Monique, who's an attorney, I don't go anywhere near that kind of policymaking environment. And then obviously social norms guiding behavior. So public policy and the change we're seeking occurs in all those environments. But we're looking at where do we intentionally want to focus our efforts on changing policy. Now, I will tell you honestly, even if you're looking at passing a state law, it has to be rooted in some ways in social norms. Now, a couple of years ago, I started hearing people looking at these types of public policy and grouping them in big P, little p. And honestly, I've tried to sort of do my own research to figure out who first came up with this categorization and why does it seem to come up in our groups. And honestly, I don't know. It's sort of like big P are formal laws, rules, judicial decisions, little p, organizational guidelines, internal agency decisions, and social norms. I think it's possible that people are doing this grouping, and you'll have to let me know, because folks who say, I can't lobby, so I can't do big P. All right, I will be honest with you, I don't really care for this. It comes up so often, I had to put it into this. And you'll find out a little bit later on why I'm not crazy about this. We can go on to the next one. But when if you're going to stick with that, categorization, remember big P, little p, it's not about the what, it's about the who. So
Jean, if I can
just,
because it's interesting having worked in the state government and then coming to higher education. And at the end of the day, I use the term big P and little p.
You do?
I do. And I use it, not necessarily, it's more of an internal, informal, category. And I do it in the sense of, big P is really, that's state politics. That's where you're, ultimately lobbying. That's where you've got people down at the Capitol. You're talking with the legislators. You're having, all of these deep conversations, or sometimes not so deep, depending on the, legislator. But you're having these conversations that are ultimately going to create a statewide impact that's going to be on the books, that's going to sometimes impact the judicial decisions that you basically talked about. When we get to the little p, that's more of like your internal discussions about what's like for higher ed, what's going on with this committee, what's going on with, this group who's stationed on campus, or, all of those politics that kind of develop the idea that you're going to form the public policy that you're going to take
This is
downtown.
great. This is great. I'm so glad
So-
because I just don't know who uses this term.
So
Okay.
it's almost like it's an internal discussion. And I use it because it's just like, oh my gosh, little p politics can be such a pain in the butt. And it's not that big P politics isn't, but it's like on the grand scheme of things, it seems sometimes like the little p politics get so ingrained in details that sometimes are just not important. And a lot of it is because people don't necessarily understand advocacy or lobbying or what it ultimately takes to get a decision made downtown. So you start talking about, well, okay, this has to be X number size, this has to have this number of staples, we have to have a meeting on top of a meeting, we have to basically go and, oh, I need to run this through this chain of command in order to get sign off, in order to have another meeting about what we're ultimately going to decide. That is little p politics.
Oh my gosh.
In my mind, it's just like, okay, it is a necessary evil that I have to go through in order to do what I'm trying to accomplish. And so when I see big P versus little p, it's like the big P is like, that's the work. That's the drive. That's the coup de grace, so to speak. The little p is just like, all right, how many meetings do I have to go through in order to get you to the point where you're going to make a decision so we can get downtown?
Okay.
So that's
Thank you for speaking up because still, I mean, okay, I am reformed. I am going to, I see where I can use this more.
so yeah, in that sense, that's how I use big P, little p. It's like one beyond the fact can really irritate me. And then the other one is just like, okay, this is where we're getting the work done. This is where the public policy is. The rest of it is just like, those are the ingredients to the cake that get you what you ultimately want to eat at the end of the day.
Wait, Jean Doss learned something right in the
See how
first
I use
15
that
minutes.
food,
This is great.
analogy,
Yeah, I know.
okay, I'm just saying.
So, again, looking at a common sort of understanding what we're talking about, I'm going to go to the next thing. And, we talk about advocacy, and this is interesting. Everybody's pretty comfortable with the term advocacy. It is the umbrella term, and it covers just a whole range of activities, including direct lobbying, that promote a cause through political or non-political avenues. Now, when we're looking at the next term you hear, lobbying. Now, let's be very clear. It's interesting because this term, though it is very fraught, is simple. It is asking an elected official or other individual identified as a lobbyable official to vote yes, to vote no, to amend, or to introduce a very specific bill. All right? Now, remember, lobbying is something that, people sometimes say, well, I'm a charitable nonprofit. I'm a 501c3. I can't lobby or I'll lose my IRS status. Wrong. Wrong. Nonprofits are allowed to lobby within certain limits established by the IRS. And in fact, it is intended for them to be a part of the public policy making process. But let's look at some of the other things. Sometimes you are largely funded by a foundation, and that foundation puts in your grant many, many times, thou shalt not lobby a tiny, tiny bit with any of our money. Okay, well, that's where, maybe your organizational status doesn't prohibit you, but your funding stream does. And another place where it can be a barrier sometimes is, let's say you are within a university, and that university needs to speak with a unified voice. They want to reflect democratically the interest of its people, but
Oh, thank you.
yes, yes, but they don't want Gene Dawes showing up on behalf of the Center for Regional Food Systems and lobbying on behalf of Michigan State University. It's like Dave Bertram was like, okay, Gene, really? So these are some of the restrictions and some of the things we have to understand, but we do have to understand what is not lobbying. Monitoring public policy, monitoring legislations that introduced at the state level, or monitoring various food service directors' policies, looking at what's going on at a county or a zoning level. Relationship building, just because you cannot lobby, however that's been expressed to you, doesn't mean you cannot do open houses, you can't do coffee hours, it doesn't mean you can't know who your state rep and state senator is. It can't mean you can't engage in a discussion about, in addition to being a mom of 2 kids or a dad who coaches soccer, I also do food policy in this way, all right? And raising awareness and educating. And all those things are not lobbying.
Can I ask a question here? Too?
Yeah.
So obviously from a good food perspective, we made people aware of a bill that was moving through last week on the bake sale bake sale bill, and I guess there are certain bills that perhaps are against good food, or that we might not want to promote widely. As we are raising awareness on certain issues, do we have to be very careful about making sure we are raise awareness on all issues, or just on the issues that we've got to, yeah. I guess that's a question. I'm not sure where we stand from an MSU perspective or a nonprofit perspective.
Right,
I have an answer to add after you're done.
Yeah, I'm going to get into this a little bit more later and actually talk about some of this. Monique,
Well, and I'm not sure if the bill you were talking about might have been like the cottage food legislation or some other pieces. And, as an MSU entity, so to speak, granted, we have a governmental affairs office. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, in the past, our office has not been that engaged with a lot of the different units on campus. Over the past few years, since we, completely revamped it, I've been part of that revamping. Right. We've tried to reach out to the units that are on campus to see, it's like, what are your issues? Because a lot of times, David Bertram, who actually goes down that Jean just mentioned, mm-hmm. And handles the day-to-day lobbying, you can make him aware of those issues, and then he can, kind of keep up with what's going on, let you know how they're going, kind of give some insight on what's useful, let you know whether or not as a university we can take a position on it, or if it has issues like that. Or even, if there's an expert in that particular area, come down to the Capitol and basically provide testimony on it. That's not always going to be the case, but it is always good to kind of let our office know if there are things that are really, really, problematic, then we can definitely help advise as far as that issue is concerned, and sometimes take a position. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to know every single thing that it is that you're working on, or that, you might have an interest in, that it may not rise to that level. But if it's something that is so egregious that, you want a position on it, you can always talk to our office about that.
Well, we're going to come back to this Free the Krispy Kreme bill later on and see. I'm speaking, by the way, yes, I'm speaking for myself here, nobody else. Okay, so basically just, to sort of put to close out this section, organizations can involve yourself in public policy advocacy without the activity being considered as lobbying. And, you can be involved in strategic planning that ultimately has a lobbying goal, even if you are not a group that cannot lobby. But you have to be thoughtful about it. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Are there any questions? We're going to, I'm sorry. We're going to be, before we start going on to our legislative process 101.
And feel free to put questions in the chat pod, folks, as we go on, and I'll field those questions as at the right opportunities.
Okay. So next we're going to look at the place, the players, and the process. And I'm going to go real quickly, since we're a little bit behind. I'm going to go real quickly through the next couple of slides. Michigan's had 3 capitals. Go ahead. And we started as a territorial courthouse in 1832, and you have 5 years later, when Michigan became a state, that became our capital. Lots of politics decided that we should move our capital to Lansing. This was a Capitol building in Lansing for about a decade there. In 1872, the cornerstone was laid for the Capitol as we know it today. You can see in these pictures, the building, next one, you can see the dome partially built. And it was completed in 1879, and it is it's a stunning building. I said before this webinar started that I love this Capitol like a man. It is beautiful. It's one of the rare capitals that's actually on the National Historic Register because it's been restored to as it was when it first opened, minus a couple significant things like spittoons. Okay, so all right.
Or
so
the cattle in the basement.
There were cattle in the basement.
There were cattle in the basement. Yes,
Monique,
that is where they kept all of the sheep, the cows, the horses. So if you actually go down below the first floor, when they go in those like open holes in the floor and the people go, that is ultimately where they brought the horses, and the hay was down there. It was, you got to take the Capitol tour. I'm sorry.
I've done the okay, all right. So anyways, okay, we did the place, state capitol, and by the way, you do not have to have an appointment or a leader. You can walk into that building at any time. Okay, now here's a slide that is not very good, so don't read it. Just let me do it here. Okay, so the players. All right, at the state legislative level, you want to ask yourself, who are the players? If you're looking at zoning at your county commissioner or city council, you want to ask, who are the players? For the state legislature, we have 110 members in the House. We have 38 members in the Senate. That's 148 legislators, not a huge number. Oh, but those are organized into 24 standing committees, 18 subcommittees. We have in the Senate 21 standing committees. And by the way, there's over 600 or more House and Senate individual staff, policy staff, Legislative Service Bureau, House and Senate fiscal agencies. Those three groups I just mentioned are nonpartisan and independent. You have the governor's administration and all the departments. So, but what you really, if you're looking at public policy, where you start is for just understanding that the clock is ticking. All right? It is a process. Like a basketball game, it has a distinct beginning and a distinct ending with very distinct winners and losers at the end. Okay, we are sort of about, not, I wouldn't quite say halfway through the 98th legislative session, which is 2015-2016. We're a full-time legislature. You may have heard of part-time legislators. You may have actually heard of our one nation's unicameral legislature, Nebraska. We are bicameral. And one of the things that I think, we were talking about barriers to public policy advocacy. People hear the word politics and they think all sorts of negative things. And what I want you to understand is we are not political. We do not engage in anything. And I really mean that, we largely. We are not engaged in seeing someone win an election or lose. We're not engaged in seeing that the Democrats or the Republicans get ahead. But we have to be politically savvy. And that means understanding the politics. Now, I just want to take a second and tell you just how incredibly ignorant I was when I first got hired as a lobbyist. I thought that to run for office, that's when you had to have that little D after your name or an R, because you had to run on a ticket. I thought as soon as you won election and you showed up in Lansing and got your office, that D and R was just put away in a drawer till the next election cycle. I had no idea that it continues to be the anatomy of a chamber. So for example, our House right now is 63 Republicans, 47 Democrats. Our Senate is only 11 Democrats. They all get committee assignments and they all get to be vice chairs of something. And that means that the leadership in both chambers are Republican. It means the committee chairs are all Republicans. It means the majority in every committee is a Republican majority. Now, does this mean Republicans are total power despots and horrible people? No. Monique and I have served when there's been majorities in the House of Democrats. They do the same things. But this is important to understand, again, not because your own political persuasion, I mean, you may have a personal feeling about this, but as advocates, we just need to know this because as we look for champions, it's important that we have Republican champions, okay? We never ignore the minority, but you have to understand the strategic importance of Republicans in this legislature. All right, going really quickly, we've got 110 House seats. There's the Cora Bell Anderson office building, the next slide. And that's, by the way, the house is built over Ottawa Street, sort of over the street there. This is the Farnham building. and this is where most our senators have their offices. Now, I will tell you for both the Anderson and the Farnham building, most House reps and senators, but for those in leadership and those with seniority, they can have offices in the Capitol, okay? Now, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time. I just wanna tell you, here is a great opportunity. Go to www.legislature.mi.gov. And that's going to be like your homepage. And if you look at publications, one of the publications you can look at is the Citizens Guide. Now, right now, you're going to see first glance. Any day now, this document is going to be changed to the Citizens Guide. And it is a wonderful document. It has pictures of all the legislators. It has the maps you saw earlier. It has a legislative process. Legislators print these for free out of their office budgets. And it's a great first connect, first ask is, when you have these printed in your office, you may not have them yet, Representative, could you send me a copy? Now we're going to get to the juicy part here, which is the process. And it's really, this is the thing that I think is the greatest barrier to folks engaging, is that it's been a long time since fourth grade, and
A lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a
okay,
bill.
so, okay, we can stop that. Yes, that's your entertainment. Okay, so,
And now we'll stop.
now, interestingly enough, this is from the 1975 Schoolhouse Rock. You would be amazed at the people who go back to this little cartoon to remember how a bill becomes a law. But moving on, it really basically understand that in that 2-year period, close to 5,000 bills will be introduced. Some will be introduced very early in the legislative session. I had a bill introduced in the last day. And people were saying, why the heck are you doing this? But it was because I could stand in line a little closer to the front of the line in the next session, Now, understand as well that only 20% of those 6,000 bills that are introduced ever pass. I want to let that sink in. And this is true for Congress as well. Now, ideas for bills come from all sorts of groups, not just out of the legislator's head. Sometimes those bills have been around forever. I mean, it took us 16 years to pass a seatbelt law in Michigan. My guess, that bill was led by one particular legislator and then passed on to another legislator. And basically, bills are introduced. They're given a number. It's HB for House bills, SB for Senate bills. And the numbers are sequential in the order in which they're introduced. Interestingly enough, the first bill of the session introduced in the Senate is Senate Bill 1, but the first bill introduced in the House in any 2-year session is House Bill 4000. And basically understand the bills are introduced, they're assigned to a committee in the chamber in which they're introduced, where most die. If that committee chair decides to take them up, if it passes, then it goes before the full chamber, and if it passes with, remember, the numbers that really matter in this is 56 in the House and 20 in the Senate. If it passes, yay, it has to repeat the entire process in the next chamber. And in Michigan, like a woman that when she gets married doesn't change her name but only hyphenates, bills do not change their name when they go from one chamber to the next. If they were Senate Bill 1 and they started the process in the Senate, they remain Senate Bill 1 as it moves over to the House. That's something that confuses folks. Now, when we look at what really matters in the legislature, you need to have 56 votes in the House minimum, 20 minimum in the Senate, and then that magical 1, which is the governor's signature. Now, this is not great, but I got to tell you, I have been trying to find a simple schematic, how a bill becomes a law. Leave it to Michigan 4H. We'll have this up, but this is a really nice document. You can't see it right here, but we'll get that later. The other thing I want to point out is also, remember the Citizens Guide that legislators can get printed? Here's another booklet that legislators print out of their own office guides. The legislative process in Michigan, a student's guide, pretty good. You could go to www.legislature.mi.gov. You could actually look at that document online. Now, in talking about that process, I want to talk about just a couple things, and here again is a slide that doesn't work so well. Here are recent challenges, and I'm so glad my friend Monique is here because we together have seen these changes. The voters in the early 90s decided to make our legislature a term-limited legislature, and when we say term limits, legislators in the House are limited to 3 terms. Each term is 2 years. So the lifetime maximum they can serve in the House is 6 years. In the Senate, senators are elected for a 4-year term. They have lifetime limits of 2 terms. So the most we get our senators is 8.
Continuous or that's over the
Lifetime. Some occasionally you'll see someone elected to office, serve 1 term, maybe they're defeated or maybe they step out and then come back because they can serve 1 or 2 more terms. So this, at the beginning of this session, in the 2015-16 legislative session, 41 of the freshmen were rookies. After the next election cycle, which is 2016, 27 of our 38 senators will be freshmen. Now, not to horrify you, most of them will not truly be freshmen. Most will come out of the House, and we're going to have a new governor. So maintaining relationships is really hard. There's no institutional memory except with lobbyists. It's less time to get to know legislators and develop a trusting relationship. And also, for another reason, most elections are decided in the primary. Now let's talk about how it really works, okay? And it's not that, bills are, yes, introduced, and yes, the Constitution gives the public a committee. The committee is when the public is given time to speak on a bill. But if you wait to speak to a bill when it's in committee, in this state, you are incredibly late. Now, people come to the process late all the time. But basically, how it really works, and this is really key, legislators depend on advocates, not just to educate them, but also to do what is needed to move the bill through the process. And in that sense, legislators don't have power, they count. Something that Monique and I get asked all the time, and sort of joking, the way lobbyists talk to each other is, do you know how to lobby? Do you know how to count to 56 and 20? Because in the end, and I can tell you, good lobbyists and good legislators can look at a bill the day it's introduced and estimate to you how many votes it has in the committee, how many votes it has on the floor, and frankly, whether it's dead in arrival or not, and whether those numbers, if we can move those numbers. So, and really, again, there's a sense for some beginning advocates that basically the bill's introduced and then it's in the hands of this wonderful legislator, when in fact that legislator has limited power. He or she is depending on advocates to educate the committee members, to educate their colleagues. And the other thing too is legislators don't act just because something is the right thing to do. It's got to be feasible, and there are legislators every year that introduce bills that are actually never going to pass. I can think of Senator Martha G. Scott. Every single day stood up on the floor of the Senate.
Yes, she did.
And spoke to her bill that would have established a process by which people could get auto insurance in Detroit that was affordable. That bill never got a hearing in committee.
It did not, but every single day she would stand up in session and she would say, pass my bill.
Yes.
It never passed, but yes, she would stand up every single day.
Now that's an example of a legislator who knows that the actual likelihood of her bill passing was not likely, but she was committed to using every ounce of her own power as an elected official. That is every ounce of her bully pulpit. So when we look at ourselves as advocates, yes, we educate, but we also, it's our job to create that political climate in which the right things are possible.
So let me add one thing here, because you make an important point. Sometimes a piece of legislation is introduced and it's not going to be passed, and I think it kind of takes me back to the big P little p conversation almost, because sometimes even though the policy is not going to change statewide, does not necessarily mean that you can effectuate change on a lower level. Maybe you can, basically come together and decide, it's like, we want to, I'll continue with the Detroit issue. We want to change, redlining in Detroit, which is what the bill was about. And so no, we did not do that on a state level, but maybe on a local level, they start making some changes in local government. Maybe you get the county commissioners that decide to do resolutions and ultimately create changes in small pockets. So you may not necessarily, when you introduce a bill, get to the 56-20, but that does not mean that you can effectuate change on a lower level. And then ultimately, once you create that change there, that can be used in another session to basically say, we've done it here, we've created that ground support, and then we can come back to the legislature, reintroduce the bill, and maybe make some changes then. So
That's, I'm really glad you brought that up. And I guess I also want to say something that, I've been doing this 24 years, and I have a lot of dark moments. I have times when just the disaster I personally believe term limits has been just strikes home. There is no question that without publicly funded campaigns, the influence of money in our legislature, I'm not naive, is overwhelming. And yet I will tell you that the power of a legislator, the power that they count, the power that they look at, ultimately is the power of the constituent. There's an old saying, and I remember when a legislator told me, you dance with the one that brung you. There you go. And you can always beat big money. You can always beat big power if you have unified numbers of voters speaking for an issue and committed to the long run. So just as people, approach the legislative process with cynicism, I just want to say, never underestimate the power of one constituent speaking to his or her elected officials. Now, we talked about this. I want to, that's good. We can go. We've already covered that. So I'm going to go to the lobbyist template. Now, do you remember at the beginning of this, I said that I'm talking today about my world, which is the state legislature. But many of you are engaged in public policy change and advocacy at a school level, at perhaps an institutional level where you're working on a policy, or a school board. You still are going to use this template. Carry this in your back pocket. What do you want? Who can give it to you? What do they need to hear? And who do they need to hear it from? Or for your grammarians, from whom do they need to hear it from? Okay. Now let's look, we're going to move ahead and look at this template in a couple different examples. Oh, by the way, this is something that the steering committee, we're going to be using. This is a tool you've been given. I'm not going to cover it today, but if you actually look at this worksheet, it is those 4 questions spread out in a little bit more detail, but it is, and I just would argue that this workshop is not this worksheet is not comprehensive, but it's a good way to start building a written plan. Now, let's look at this example here. All right, this is the Good Food Charter. And we're going to look at that template. What do you want? Who can give it to you? What do they need to hear? Who do they need to hear it from? So number 12 has to do with implementing a reimbursement program to provide an additional 10 cents per meal to supplement existing school meal funds in order to purchase. That's okay. It's just a snapshot.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Jude is trying to give you a nice bigger picture, but it's just a snapshot of that page. In order to purchase locally grown fruits and vegetables. It's okay. So if you look at the building symbol, remember the Michigan Good Food Charter is 25 priorities, and they're organized by virtue of where the policy change needs to occur. This is clearly defined as legislation-based. Now it's interesting, if you look at number 12, there's a little building, and that building is not government. That symbol, if you look at the key at the bottom of the Good Food Charter, that means it's institution-based. So let's look at this issue and what happened just recently. Diane Connors, who's a senior policy specialist, food and farming for Michigan Land Use Institute, just had a recent experience. And let's remember, what we're doing here is we're asking, what do we want? Okay. Diane wants to see schools have adequate resources to be able to purchase locally grown food for school meals. And she is starting at a very, small scale. She's a pilot in the Grand Traverse area. And I actually should know more about the scope of that, but we got a call from her a couple weeks ago, and she said, Mark Coe with Goodwill Farm to Freezer, and also Mark is also a board member of the Manistee Farm Bureau, and Tom Freitas, I may be mispronouncing his name, who's a food service director for the Traverse City Area Public Schools, spoke to Senator Darwin Boer. Senator Darwin Boer covers that up into that area. There's another senator that covers Traverse City per se, but right up to that area. And he learned from these 2 men about this program. And he is absolutely fascinated, wants to do this. and he's a Republican. He's very enthusiastic. His committee assignments, looking at, what do you want? Who can give it to you? Can Senator Borg give it to you based on his committee assignments? I'm not entirely sure. He's on one standing committee that applies. He is a member of appropriations, but not those specific subcommittee where I would see this 10 cents a meal coming from. But in any event, yeah, he's a senator. So what happens next? They refer him to Diane. Diane has a long conversation with staff. And so that is, I haven't talked to her to find out where that's going. But again, think about this. What do you want? We want kids to have access to healthy foods, and we want to also source that local food from Michigan farmers, okay? So we're going to add 10 cents a meal. That's what we want. Who can give it to you? It's money. We're thinking it will either come from locals or foundations, but we actually, to do this on a broad scale, we think what we want is a state appropriation. So what do we want? State appropriation. Who can give it to you? A state legislator. What do they need to hear? They need to hear that it's good, that it's doable, that it's feasible. And who do they need to hear from? Now, this is a mistake that a lot of advocates make. They think they are the best messenger. Diane probably knows more about this. Most people in the state, if not the nation. But who is the best messenger? A local farmer and businessman, and a school food service director that could say, no, this is not some crazy pie in the sky university idea. We're actually doing this. Those were the best messengers. Okay, we're going to go on. Now, the next, if you look at number 2 in the Good Food Charter, improve school food environments and reduce school sales of low nutrient, high sugar, high fat, and calorie dense foods through snack and vending machines or competitive food sales. Now, if you look at where this is in our good food agenda, it's under community-based, and it's impacting kids. So as we look at our efforts on this, probably most folks are working with their local PTA and their school boards. Well, lo and behold, in February, Senate Bill 139, sponsored by Senator Patrick Colbeck, would amend the revised school code to require the Department of Ed to take all steps necessary to ensure the maximum state and local control over implementation of school meal programs, including establishing an upper limit on the number and frequency of fundraising activities that could take place in a public school that features sale of food, beverage that do not meet nutritional standards, not to be limited to less than 3 times a week. This is called the Free the Krispy Kremes bill, because a group of students from a school came forward and said, we used to be able to raise thousands of dollars for our honor student club by selling Krispy Kreme donuts, and now we can't. Now, interestingly enough, I brought this up at dinner last night at my brother. He has 2 teenage kids. His daughter is in the French club. They used to raise $2,000 a year by selling croissants, and they can no longer do this. And we had a major argument over what is the purpose of this stupid policy. Now, there are some of you out there that are just horrified when you hear about this bill. And, this is an example you're saying of if we are looking at policies, we obviously sort of look at our activities in 2 ways. We look at proactive, things we're trying to move forward in whatever policy process, and then we look at our defensive. Now, what's interesting about this is it moved incredibly quickly. It passed through the Senate with 37 out of 38 senators voting for it. The Senate fiscal analysis doesn't talk about any downside. So clearly, folks who have a different view of this have not been mobilized yet. What do we do? What do we do at the Center for Regional Food Systems? We cannot lobby. But we can monitor, we can educate, we can provide people with the tools to express their views. We won't tell you whether this is a good or bad bill. Obviously, we have our opinions. Obviously, we think this is absolutely contrary to the Good Food Charter. But we can't lobby. We can let you know this bill is moving quickly. I can tell you right now, if you wish to express your opinions on this bill, you will want to express them to your state representative, and specifically Representative Amanda Price, who chairs the committee that has control over this bill right now. What do you want? Well, some of you may want to kill this bill. Some of you may want to amend it. Who can give it to you? Right now, the Senate's done with it. It's in the House control, the House committee control. What do they need to hear? Well, frankly, obviously they haven't heard any opposing arguments because most of the senators, and I gotta tell you, it's kind of rare to see bills passing unanimously, and Yeah, we can, and Amanda, thank you for speaking up. We can also make local food policy councils aware of it so they can consider what they might want to do. So you look at the different players. If you're a nonprofit, if you're a local food policy council, you sure as heck can lobby. But if you're the Center for Regional Food Systems and your consultant, Jean Doss, is doing the monitoring for you, can't lobby. How do we communicate and stay within the boundaries, stay within the rules, okay? Now let's go to the next thing here. Basically, House Bill 4012 was introduced very early this year, and it would create a new section in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, the Homestead Subsistence Farming Act. Basically says if a structure is lawfully used as a residence under a zoning ordinance, the production of farm products and the property where the structure is located for consumption by the residents is a lawful use and is not subject to special use. I'm going to hit the pause button. Drew, thanks for bringing up this question. She's asking, can you talk a little bit about how a bill gets fast-tracked? A bill is fast-tracked when those in power want it to be. First of all, who can fast-track a bill? Well, it obviously has to have the support of the Senate and or the House and the governor. Okay, it has to be a priority for one or more of those leaders, okay? It also can be fast-tracked when there is a crisis that needs to be addressed. If you have a flood in South Central Michigan and there's an issue with creating a fund to quickly reimburse for the costs, that can be fast-tracked because of a crisis. It can be fast-tracked politically. 2 years ago, there was a group that was collecting signatures to put on the ballot a significant increase in the minimum wage. This was problematic if you are a Republican, because the Republican Party, its key stakeholders, Chamber of Commerce, Michigan Manufacturing, saw that as a not good idea. For those who are political, they saw a minimum wage ballot proposal on the ballot as not a good idea because a lot of Democrats who might not otherwise be motivated to vote would come to the polls. So a bill establishing a minimum wage, an increase in the minimum wage, was fast-tracked, passed through the legislature, and basically making that ballot initiative moot. I hope that helps, Drew. Come back, let us know if there's more, and if there's some folks. Okay, Amanda Edmonds, is fast-tracked an official process or just a description? It's just a description. It still has to go through, well, now see, there's exceptions to everything. Does a bill have to go through a committee and then the floor vote and then the Senate committee and then the full Senate? There are rules that allow leadership to discharge a bill from a committee and move it on the House floor, but there's a constitutional requirement that that bill lay over 5 days. So you can fast track as much as you want, and there are ways to speed up parts of the process, but it still has to go through a process of approval of 56 votes in the House and a process of approval in the Senate of 20. So Drew asked, and when you say fast track, what's a time frame in comparison to the normal time frame? Well, there is no normal time frame because 80% of bills die. A fast track bill, I can't tell you, Drew. We could probably go back and find the fastest ever bill, the fastest time it took a bill to pass all the way through the process and tell you. But remember, you also can start out saying, I'm Senator Arlen Meekhoff. I'm the Senate Majority Leader. I want to fast track this. Okay, ooh, Justin is telling us the sound is cutting out. And Senator Meekhoff may be able to fast track something through his own bill, but through his own chamber, but maybe Representative Cotter, the Speaker of the House, has heard from his local officials and doesn't think this bill should be fast tracked, so we don't know. Okay, so evidently we're having some problems with sound cutting out. Okay, it came back. Okay, cool. So let me go back to House Bill 4012. Okay, this bill is introduced by a Republican. There's not been any committee hearing on it. It's sort of an interesting bill. This would be something, do we want to highlight this? Your question at the beginning is, if we get involved in one, Is it our, if we get involved in educating people about one, is it our responsibility to educate about all? And that's a fair question. I think if you only had a history of focusing on one bill, and you clearly knew that in educating your stakeholders about the bill, it clearly would be something that they want to mobilize in opposition to. Is that not lobbying by virtue of applying a priority? And this is where there are not, we're going back to the very beginning of this, which is, can you lobby or not? And I think you just want to be very careful and kind of decide how you're going to handle this. Now, I think one reason we're even doing this is because the Good Food Charter, there are certain goals that are not going to move forward but for legislative action. So we have to confront that issue of somebody got to organize, somebody got to lobby if we're going to meet this priority, okay? At the same time, we have a bill that one could argue, and I'm just speaking for myself here, is in direct conflict with one of the priorities. So I think what I always recommend groups do in looking at, first of all, aligning their resources, aligning their people power, is sort of have a plan in advance. Know that we're going to reserve a certain amount of capacity for defensive, know that we're going to reserve a certain amount of capacity for proactive. And then I would also just say that you want to be if you are a non-lobbying entity, you want to be very careful and ask yourself, remember, what is lobbying? It's asking somebody to vote yes, vote no, vote to amend, or introduce a bill. And if your communications around a bill are distinctly, here's a bill, you have your own views about this, but here's a bill, and here's where it is. That's monitoring. Now, I would just agree that if you are consistently only acting to kill bills, or acting on bills that your stakeholder groups probably don't like, but, here's a bill that I don't know if this is something that has legs, is what we say as a lobbyist. I don't know if we'd want to get behind it. It's not really exactly in one of the priorities of the Good Food, but I think it's interesting. It's actually interesting, too, when you think of the potential future activity around right to farm, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so moving really quickly, here's another, what do you want, who can give it to you? GAMPs, we all know about GAMPs, generally accepted agricultural management practices established in the Michigan Right to Farm Act. Basically, it is a way to provide an umbrella of protection against nuisance litigation if what you are doing as a farmer is according to these practices, which are intended to be scientifically based, updated annually, to utilize current technology, promoting sound environmental stewardship on Michigan farms, okay? Now, there was quite a bit of controversy about a year ago with, was it a year ago? Gosh, time flashes fast, with a GAMP that was passed that had to do with livestock in certain settings. And I won't get into that right now, but again, let's go back to what we're talking about right here, which is the Lobbyist Template. What do you want? Who can give it to you? What do they need to hear, and who do they need to hear it from? So in this instance, this is a GAMP that you like or don't like, or any one of these GAMPs. And who can give it to you? Well, the legislature has given the Michigan Commission on Agriculture and Rural Development the power to pass these policies. So that commission, those are the folks who can give it to you. Those are the people that you are focusing on. That's the process you want to understand. How is it by which that they pass GAMPs? What is the process? And then you're going to think, who are the best people to speak? We call those messengers. And what are the best messages? So moving on, I don't want to spend a lot of time because we could spend a lot of time on GAMPs. So basically, now's where I want to sort of step back. Remember what I told you about on my worst days? The thing that sort of brings me home to a sense of possibility, that good things that seem like a long stretch can happen, is because of the power of that constituent. One letter from a constituent to an elected official, because so few people ever communicate, is seen as representing at least 10, people will give you different numbers, 10 or 20 other voters. In some instances, one well-drafted letter early in the process, sort of fixing that legislator, sometimes the first time a policy is explained to you, the first way will sort of be your first impression of that policy. That can be a mandate. So I go back to, we can accomplish anything if we develop relationships with those people that represent us on various policymaking bodies, I'm today talking about the state legislature. So right now, I just want to say relationship building is the single most important component. And as you develop a strategic plan, whatever your policy goal is, I can tell you you're going to spend a lot of time on who are the individuals we need to have a relationship with. If it's House Ag Committee, is it the Senate Ag Committee? Who's on that committee? Who do we know that has a relationship with that senator, that chair, or the members? I think this next slide, see if I've got it here. Yeah, the legislature is about power. It responds to power, and that power is the power of the constituent, all right? You will have a lot of people that will tell you that money, they'll tell you about other influences, party influences, but this is what we hold true to, because if we do our job and developing relationships and educating legislators and making sure the messengers are not just the person who thinks they're the smartest advocate in the room, but someone who lives in that legislator's district, that's how we win. Now, this is another kind of crummy slide. Sorry, guys. We have a handout that sort of asks you, these are sort of things to ask as you get to know legislators. The one thing I always want to know is, what do they know about food policy? I've met with a lot of farmers, and, I talk about my client, the Center for Regional Food Systems, and I talk about food policy. And here is someone whose whole life is food, but they may not really know about food policy advocates. And it may not, their first impression or their first thought may not necessarily be positive. But can we find somebody that lives in their district who can talk about what they do? Obviously, we talked about the fact that it's really important for us to know folks who are in the majority party. It's really important for us to know folks who are on certain committees. So I'm going to leave that because that's obviously, that's just I gave you that handout as something that you are going to use as you develop your strategic plan. Now, I've been talking a lot, and at this point, I want to hand this over to Monique Field, Assistant VP for Strategic Initiatives at MSU. Again, we've known each other way too long, and you will not find too many people who have played a role in so many ways at the state legislature, from being a policy staffer to being a director, a liaison, a deputy director of government for the governor, to being with part of the administration as a department deputy representative, to actually being, I'm losing track of all the different places, to being being a multi-client lobbyist. So, I mean, you look at all the sides of this process that she's seen. We're really lucky to have her here today, and you're not going to find too many people that can speak with that breadth of experience. So passing it off to Monique, take it from here.
Okay, well, one of the things that I really want to focus on is the relationship building. And Jean spent a lot of time and kind of, made the perfect segue for relationship building. I came to MSU 4 years ago, it'll be 4 years in October. And in that time, the reason was to ultimately create an advocacy program for the university. We didn't have one before. Basically, the university relied on extension. Extension had what we called the green wave. And if there was an issue, then, the messages would go out through the extension county officials. They would send them to their boards. They would go out to the farmers. They'd go out to their partners. And all of a sudden, you would have the legislature hearing from our extension groups. Well, and you can click to the next slide. In 2011, that changed and backfired on us. And ultimately, what happened was Governor Snyder came into office. He cut higher education 15% right off the top. Extension does not get any of those general fund dollars that ultimately come into the university. As a result of that, for the university, it was $42 million that we ultimately left. And from that, we had to completely change the way extension looked. We didn't talk to anybody about that, and that was where the backfire came. There were a lot of people who ultimately were laid off. There were a lot of changes that took place as far as what extension looked like, and there were a lot of people that were not happy about it. So instead of MSU at that time basically, looking at their constituents, looking at their partners and making a determination, it's like, we've got relationships with these people. Let's figure out, what's going to be best. They made a decision. They implemented it. They had to because there was no money, and then moved forward. Instead of that green wave ultimately saying, oh, yes, we support you and we understand that you're not getting any dollars and you can't pay for this, all of a sudden they were using those same connections to legislators and blasting MSU a new one. We were getting, emails and phone calls from legislators basically talking about how horrible and the university was and how we had left behind the land grant mission. At that point in time, President Simon decided we need an advocacy program. So I was hired to create an advocacy program. And let me just say, it was something new because, as Jean said, I was used to doing direct lobbying. I was the one that was downtown and I was working with the clients. I didn't know a thing about, okay, creating the grassroots. That's a completely different kind of outreach, so to speak. And so one of the first things that I had to look at was, well, what do people understand about the university and what we do? At the end of the day, most legislators look at MSU as we are a football team, we are a basketball team, and we are 4-H. They don't know a whole lot else about MSU. So my goal was to basically educate. And so in doing that, and I think we can probably go to the next slide. What I ultimately did was create a My Spartan Impact website. And that website was ultimately designed to create that educational system. And that gets to, where Jean is basically making sure that you're figuring out who those players are, what they can give you, what they can do for you. Well, it's like we knew who the players were. We knew what they could do for us, but they didn't know anything about us. And so you've really got to think about what is it that you're going to take the time to educate them on. Is it just going to be, one particular facet about what you're doing, or do you give them the overall structure of all of the different things you engage in? And sometimes that's just a matter of identifying the who that you want to talk to and what their interests are, because that is very key. Because a lot of times, one of the things that I found out as I was going around to the different extension districts and talking to the different people were they were only focused on something that happened to them 10 and 20 years ago. So all of a sudden it became, okay, either you didn't let my kid in, or, you cut this program, or, you got rid of the blueberry, research. And all of a sudden it was brought to my attention that, okay, our constituents really don't understand the university. So that way, when they're communicating to the legislators on their own, whether we're asking them to or not, they're not communicating accurate information, which is causing a problem for MSU overall. And so that kind of gets to why it is so important that you make sure that you have a very strong message, that you have a strategic plan, and that you know who it is that you're ultimately talking to. Because we had to develop a plan and basically say, okay, what is our message going to be? What are we ultimately going to look at? Because I'm not doing the day-to-day lobbying anymore. What I'm doing is ultimately going out in the state and communicating with our partners, with our alumni, with our constituents, and basically saying, hey, this is who MSU really is. This is what's going on with our budget. This is why tuition is what it is. And instead of basically taking it out on us, then look at those groups that ultimately impact the budget that we have, and that's the legislature. So as a result of that, you really, really need to figure out, as Jean was saying, it was like, well, who has those relationships? It was like, who in the community is best friends with, Senator Boer, or who happens to be related to the Speaker of the House? Who can actually communicate your message? And so that's why I created the Spartan Advocate. And the Spartan Advocate is basically designed to ultimately say, here's the message. This is what we've got to accomplish. We've got to get more funding into the university. These are what our challenges are. If you don't understand what's going on a particular issue, here are the fact sheets. We lay them out for you. And then from that point, it's here's the message that you can basically send to your legislator, add your own piece of it. And so what I've found is as I've gone to talk to different alumni clubs, a lot of them do get into the fact, well, we're set up as a nonprofit organization. We can't lobby, we can't get engaged in this. But what they can do is educate. I mean, what they can do is ultimately build those relationships with people within their community. They can begin to carry the message that they learn about from the university and then take it when they see a news report, when they hear a radio, when they hear something that's going on that's not necessarily right. All of a sudden, you become that voice in your community to carry that message. And it's really interesting because, Extension has such a great reach into the community. I mean, that's what gets MSU into all 83 counties. And so as a result of all of that community outreach, one of the things that is just really, really important is to make sure that we give people the tools that they need to create those relationships. So let's say I've gone and I've talked to the alumni up in Traverse City. And Traverse City has a great extension program, and they do a lot of work with the legislators. And part of that is using the opportunities that you ultimately already have at your disposal, whether it's you've got a group that meets in this particular county, and you've got county commissioners that come and they talk with you. Well, county commissioners, at the end of the day, they end up becoming state legislators.
They're the farm team.
So they are the farm team. And so as Jean was talking about those term limits, one of the things that's very important for us to do, which is important for anyone who's doing advocacy, is you got to get to them before they get to the House. You got to get to them before they get to the Senate. Because by the time they get there, they've already established preconceived notions about what their position is on things. If you can talk to them while they're still in the community, if you can get to them before, that big D and that big R basically gets attached to them like, it is their identifier, then all of a sudden you start laying that groundwork early. And things that are important to you then mentally become important to them because they knew you before they became legislator that has to follow the caucus, that has to cast a vote. They automatically know who you are. And so when you get to them, when they're in their office, then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I knew you back in my district. So the slide that she talked about as far as the power is in the constituent, I mean, at the end of the day, the governmental affairs office, yeah, we've got, lobbyists in our governmental affairs office. You know what? The legislators don't want to hear from us. I mean, as far as they're concerned, we are paid assassins, basically. We come into their office, we're basically like, hey, this is what we want. We are paid to carry a message. So while they'll give us things because that is the process, our message is not as important as the constituents, as our alumni, as, the partners that we have. They're not paid to carry that message. It's important to them. They have the passion for it. So if I can reach a group of alumni that's in a particular county with a legislator that I'm having a problem with, then all of a sudden I say, hey, I need you to carry this message. This is why it's important. And then all of a sudden they start shooting off emails. They start making phone calls. They start doing office visits. They start showing up or even inviting that legislator to take a tour of some facility they've got in their district. Well, all of a sudden, that's a brand new, legislator. And we have seen those type of things really make an impact. We could have told them the same thing over and over and over again. But at the end of the day, when someone else who has a passion for it, when someone else who's doing it goes in and basically said, this is why this is important, and do it in their districts. I mean, get to them not when they're there, in Lansing, because they're so busy. You can sit up there and you can see them and they're trying to listen, but they've got so many people coming to them with so many different issues, you kind of get lost. But if you come to them in their districts, then all of a sudden it's just like, well, you're voting for me, it's like, or I want you to vote for me. And this is what I was ultimately put here to do, is protect your interest and make sure that you're getting what you need. And so show up at their district hours, show up at their coffee hours, show up and make an appointment and get to know who their staff is. Invite them to things that are actually taking place in their district that you're doing so they can see it firsthand. For example, Joel Johnson was the chair of the Ag Committee in the House. And we had an alumni that basically grew potatoes. And one of the things that I didn't know, and it's like, who knew potatoes could be so interesting? But they grew the potatoes in water rather than dirt. And they have like a $3 billion business that's in this, little hole in the wall town. As a result of that, we brought in some legislators, we brought in Farm Bureau, we brought in some of the State Department people to take a tour of this facility. We got them on tape basically talking about how important, this research was and how important, growing these potatoes were for providing food. And all of a sudden, we now have an advocate in the legislature that we couldn't have paid for. It is one of those things where it's just like making it real to them, making it personal to them, all of a sudden makes it important to them. And I think that's really, really key, is you can message until the cows come home. You can basically show up in their offices and take a number. But if you can get them in their districts and take them to meet people that are really, really being impacted by what you're trying to accomplish, then it's like they say, a picture, speaks 1,000 words. At the end of the day, that is ultimately what makes a difference.
Thank you. That's just, that's an amazing story. Just so people know, we didn't really coordinate beforehand. I had no idea what this woman was going to share. And I got to tell you, I'm just really, she's going to continue, by the way. One of the things that I developed 10 years ago for what was then the CS Mott group was a document, 10 Commandments of Public Policy Advocacy. And I can tell you, like the other 10 commandments, these are not created because people don't do them. They're created because people do them all the time. It's really helpful. We're not going to walk through them all. I can tell you which commandment is hardest for me. No, maybe I won't. But I would just say this is a document that I would say take a look at it, not at the beginning of your advocacy efforts, but periodically look at it and ask yourself, how are we doing on this area? Now, I asked Monique, I said, Monique, why don't you go ahead and tell me your favorites of these 10? She says, oh, I can tell you what my favorite is. Let's see, keep going. You can go to the next slide. There we go. So these are Monique's favorite of the 10 top commandments.
It is. And it gets back to having a plan. And, I am not one of the most organized people in the world. Once you become a lobbyist and even an attorney, I think you learn how to fly by the seat of your pants. But the one thing that is really, really important in advocacy is really understanding the environment that you're walking into. You've got to know who the people are. I mean, Jean laid it out so well. It's like you've got to know who your audience is. You've got to know who it is that you're going to target. You've got to know what your message is. And at the end of the day, it was like, well, what's the best way to communicate that message? Because sometimes you got to tweak that message depending on who you're giving the message to. I mean, I can't just basically walk in, every office and say, well, we need you to give higher education more money because MSU is so fabulous. And while we have a humongous, Spartan caucus there at the legislature, it is interesting to note that not all of our alumni are all that supportive of the university. And so sometimes we have to come to them with a different message, like, well, you may not think we're great, but county commissioner in your districts thinks we're fabulous. So get that county commissioner to deliver the message. You've got to be able to basically have something in place that tells you what your boundaries are, what you're trying to accomplish, when you're going to accomplish it, and what you're going to do as a contingency plan
Plan B.
once you actually, get there. Because at the end of the day, something is always going to go awry. And you've got to have a way to basically, circumvent that obstacle and, go at it a different direction. And you can't do that unless everybody is walking on the same page. And that's where the planning comes from. It's really, really being strategic and understanding the environment, your mission, and your goals.
And your next favorite commandment?
My next favorite commandment. Do your homework, know your, and that kind of gets into, like I started, MSU we didn't do our homework. We didn't anticipate the opposing arguments. And at the end of the day, that backfired on us. And we are still recovering from that with our constituents. But as a result, you've also got to be flexible, because you can't always take one approach and then decide that's just what I'm going to do, because that's what I decided. That's what's written down on paper. That's what we all came to the conclusion. You've got to be flexible. And at the end of the day, I think that's where, President Simon ultimately showed that flexibility by creating that advocacy and saying, okay, we did this. We can't undo it. It's not going to change. But now let's figure out what we can do to bring everybody back to that team. And, no matter what your issue is, that's always important. Don't be so, set in stone that you cannot change, and always make sure that you know the opposing argument, because somebody's going to bring it up and you've got to have an answer for it.
Right. And I just want to add here, one of my, I'll just come clean here. I grew up in Ann Arbor and I went to that school. And honestly, advocates that come out of a very progressive environment like that are oftentimes like the worst, because they can't imagine somebody opposing this particular policy. Why would anybody disagree with them? And they haven't met someone who disagrees with them. They haven't lived next door. They haven't, they maybe over Thanksgiving, Uncle Jimmy is, somebody that they experience other views from. But and I just think you really need, and lawmakers have said this to me, you need to make the opposition's argument as well as you make yours, so that I know you've done your homework.
That's right.
And legislators, it's really interesting, now that we have such term limits and such huge freshman classes, they put these freshman legislators through sort of school, how to be a legislator. And one of the things they tell them about us, lobbyists, make them tell you the other point of view. Make them explain to you, here's the argument for, okay, now give me the argument against. So.
Well, and as an attorney, I mean, my training is an attorney. And at the end of the day, you have to know the opposing side. If you're going to win, you have to know what your opposition is going to say, because you've got to be able to counter all of those and lay it out succinctly so that it makes sense. And if you don't understand where the opposing side is coming from, then at the end of the day, you really don't understand your own argument.
Okay, let's go on. And this is your third and favorite of the 10 commandments. Oh, hold it. We missed one. We missed one. That's okay. Okay, there we go. You picked this one.
I did pick that one because I am so not patient. I'm persistent, but I am not the most patient person. When I get started, I want it done, and I want it done then. Politics is that, well, you're just in it for the long haul. At the end of the day, you're in it for the long haul. One of the questions was, what's the normal process? And when I worked at Weiner Associates, one of the major initiatives was the smoke-free legislation. That took over 10 years to get signed into law. And that was the result of ultimately getting a humongous grassroots team of, the Cancer Society, the Kidney Foundation, different lobbyists, the Hospital Association. You got all of these different groups together pushing for one agenda. And that took times and doing polls and getting the community involved. And, it took over 10 years. So when we say be patient, take that in consideration. And on the federal level, well, oh my goodness, that just takes even longer. So it is one of those you cannot give up, because at some point in time, someone will actually open up that door for you. But you never know who that person is going to be. So you just have to keep going and know that in yourself, if it's important enough for you to take it up as your policy, then it's important enough for you to hold on to and keep pushing.
I just want to say that you have just MSU really has a gem of a government affairs person in Monique. I've included a slide with her contact information, and I encourage you, just look at her website. Thanks, Liz, for posting that up there. I appreciate it. We've got about 5 minutes left, and are there some questions or some comments? Is there something that you think it's important that we've missed here today? I'd love it if you pop up.
Justin's typing here.
Something I would like you to comment on is why do special sessions?
So,
What happens in these sessions?
so the question is, let's just repeat the question for those that are on. Why are special sessions called? What are some of the details around special? What happens with them?
Michigan doesn't have special sessions. You have states with a part-time legislature where they only meet 6 months every 2 years. And that's where usually it's the governor, and again, I haven't worked in other states, can call a special session.
So there is no.
Because we have a full-time legislature, now mind you, they actually follow a school calendar. So they have a 2-week spring break. But we have a beginning of the session, and then we have what's called sine die, which, in sine die is Latin, I think, for something like without day. And it will come, I can tell you, it will come sometime in December 2016, maybe the 27th, maybe the 15th, and that's it. And then everything starts back up in January 1st. So there are questions about what can happen after sine die. There's questions about a bill that is passed on the last day of session, and the governor still has 2 weeks. So you can see the governor pocket vetoing or signing bills into the next session. But we don't.
Pocket veto is if he doesn't sign it, then it's automatically vetoed.
In a particular period of time.
Yes,
Yeah.
within the 2-week
It's
time frame.
basically just no action counts as a veto.
Usually,
At the end of session.
Yeah, usually no action means the bill becomes law.
Correct.
But at a certain period of time. So, yeah, we're
getting a number of questions here. If you're meeting with legislators about issues of concern, this is from Amanda, but aren't directly connected with a bill or bill intro request, is that lobbying?
Okay, I would say if you are dealing with general issues of concern and you're not saying to them, remember, lobbying is vote yes, vote no, vote to amend, or introduce a specific bill. Now, that latter one is a little tough for us because, sometimes you can talk about, here's this problem, here's the nature of the problem, and here's the solution, and you come pretty close to saying, we think we need a bill or we think we need an appropriation. So I think that, understand, there's no, bright line. You have to decide what the bright line will be for you. And you may if you're an organization that has very strict prohibitions on lobbying, you may really focus on the education. Justin,
at one point, the Michigan Nonprofit Association had a concise breakdown of the lobbying thresholds for 501c3s. Any chance an updated version is available?
Yeah, actually, I worked on that primer. It's basically, okay. Well, I just want to say, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm very proud of that. The Michigan Nonprofit Association on their website does have a nonprofit lobbying guide. It's a little harder to find because it's about 15 years old now. So tell you what, why don't I track it down? But there's also other organizations that post the IRS limits for nonprofits. So let me get you that stuff, okay? All right, Drew, what do you got here?
In my experience, the hardest part is getting a diverse set of stakeholders, whether it's MIFMA or MMA, Michigan Meat Association, to agree on exactly what we want. What type of strategies do you recommend for membership-based organizations when they are trying to identify a roadmap for action?
Okay, this is the $1,000 question, Drew. And before you even talk to a legislator, you've got to figure out, again, going back to the lobbyist template, what do you want? And you can honestly spend more time on that. I would say this. Every organization has done the work to create a general mission and a general vision. and has examples of its members, why did you join this organization in the first place, okay? And so your initial message to lawmakers may be a very general one, just positioning your organization as a resource, explaining why people join your organization in the first place. But in really getting down to brass tacks and putting together a roadmap for action, it is time consuming. It is important to have some folks there that sort of understand the realities of the legislature, and then that's a question of, Drew, who in your organization would listen to someone who would say that's politically unlikely to happen? So you need to have some folks there to talk about what is the political feasibility of different things. And I think it's also helpful in some instances, Drew, to look at what other states are doing. And we can talk more offline, okay? So what do we have here from Justin?
I think Justin's might have been, sorry, I'm just, I need to enlarge the chat, I think that might help me. I've got a tiny little. Justin, I appreciate how effective education can be, i.e. everything except the concrete call to action, but also like to keep track of how close we are to that threshold when we actually do lobby. Based on previous work with Food Bank Council of Michigan, most nonprofits I've worked with came nowhere close to the limit.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that.
Nice to
yeah.
Add that. Thanks, Justin.
I think the threshold is something like 25% of your annual budget expended on lobbying.
Mhm.
Liz has shared the link.
Oh, Liz.
Well done, Liz.
You're so
awesome.
good.
So yeah,
Okay.
Thanks, folks. Any other questions before we get 3 minutes?
Go to the
You
next
want
slide.
last slide?
Yeah. Now we still have time for questions, but let me look
Back,
at the
sorry.
back. So feedback and parting thoughts. There's a reason I started this webinar with a graphic of a doorknob. Obviously, I'm hoping today gives you increased confidence to walk across that threshold, to take your place in that room, to take your place at that table. But I have to say this. When I talk to new advocates who finally start engaging in this and follow most of these steps, the thing they say most often is just how incredibly fun advocacy can be. And it is so enriching, and it's just so, I think the thing you might be shocked to find is once you get over that, like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start, or that legislative process is totally confusing. But once you start seeing the paths in front of you, and you start seeing that, these legislators are no different than maybe your Uncle Joe that comes to Thanksgiving and has certain conceptions about the world. And you start understanding that interacting with these folks doesn't require any kind of special skill in lobbying. Your skill is that you live in their district, or your skill is that you do these things and you have expertise and stories to share. So I just want to thank everybody for being here today. I want to thank the Center for Regional Food Systems for contracting with me to do government affairs consulting. This is part of what I do for them. We're going to be, as we mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be taking some of these and doing a much deeper dive with the steering committee. Right. And I don't know that we have a date, and I recommend use the materials I've given you in your organization. And I think that's it.
Yeah, well, I just want to add before we close, thank you so much, Jean and Monique, for coming today. I know it was a lot of preparation for you, not that you don't do this all every day, but Jean did an awesome job pulling it all together and making it layperson speak. So I think it was great to have that, and getting lots of little notes here. So thank you both very much for your time, and this is certainly built a foundation for us to build on, I think.
I'm glad
so
you're
we're really, I think we'll look forward, steering committee on the line, we'll certainly be taking this on to our next stage of how we can build strategy for our members of the steering committee. So thanks both very much, and thanks for joining us online. We'll record this for those that weren't able to join us, but we'll hopefully, if there's anyone with any further questions, do contact me, and I'll seek the answers via Jean or Monique. Okay, so we'll close now. Thank you.